Hallo, ik ben Bram van de studiedienst van LBC-NVK. Ik sta hier voor het Internationaal Vakbondshuis in Brussel om een gesprek te hebben met Luca Visentini van het Europees Vakverbond. Maybe first we want to ask whether you can explain to our members and to our union delegates what is exactly ETUC and what is exactly the role of ETUC.
Of course. Well, ETUC stands for European Trade Union Confederation. We are the only confederation at the European level for trade unions. We gather 89 members coming from all the European member states, but also for all the countries that are associated or candidated to enter the European Union. So it's 32 European countries, I mean, and these 89 confederations come from these 32 countries. They represent, so we represent through them, let's say, almost 45 million workers in the European Union and around the European Union. We are also representing 9 sectoral trade union federations at the European level that cover the different sectors. I mean. Well, we have different activities, let's say, within our scope. The first one is, of course, to discuss and negotiate also with the European Commission and the other European Union institutions, I mean the European Parliament, the Council, concerning European legislation, directives, but also more in general the policy of the European Union. With the passing of the time, especially after the economic and financial crisis in the last decade, our role has changed a bit because we were used, let's say, mainly to participate in the so-called European social dialogue. That means negotiations with the employers' organizations at the European level to participate in the legislative process of the European Union. But then, of course, after the crisis has started a few years ago, let's say, the decision-making process of the European Union has changed significantly, and a lot of power has been transferred into the hands of the Council, so into the hands of the member states. This intergovernmental approach has a bit replaced, I mean, the communitarian approach that was at the basis of the Lisbon Treaty, and so we have been obliged to some extent also to start negotiating directly with the governments, prime ministers, labor ministers, I mean, entering into also the so-called European economic governance, the semester process, I mean, making sure, I mean, that in all these economic policies and the structural reforms, the unwanted, very often, structural reforms implemented by the European Union, the trade union movement could have a voice. We struggled a lot, I mean, to change a bit our scope and our role, but I have to say that especially over the last 3-4 years, we have succeeded, I will say, to become more influential on these processes and making sure that we can really change a bit the policy of the European Union to make sure that the social agenda is concretely implemented. There are some results as well that we can show, I mean, to our members, like, for example, the proclamation of the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights that have established 20 principles for workers in Europe, I mean, to be protected. There is a big issue in terms of implementation, of course, of these achievements, but we can say that after 10 years of blind austerity, now things are changing a bit and we are moving towards more social Europe.
Okay, thank you for introducing already what the European Trade Union Confederation stands for. Sometimes the question is also asked, how does the Confederation get its funding? How does it get its get financed?
Yeah. Well, it's very simple. More than 90% of our budget, we have a budget of around, let's say, 8.5 million euros, to be very transparent, I mean, and more than 90% of this budget, maybe even 95, comes from the fees that our member organizations pay for the number of members they represent. So proportionally, I mean, each of the 89 confederations that are affiliated to the ETUC pay membership fees and they make up our budget, I mean, and we use this budget, of course, to pay our staff that is working on the different European dossiers, but also to travel around Europe, I mean, to go to visit our trade unions, our affiliates, I mean, and to be with them, I mean, for initiatives, demonstrations, conference, discussion, but also to help them in, let's say, improving their relationship with their governments, with employers, etc., etc. So yeah, 90-95% of the money we get, it comes really from the affiliates, And this, I would say, makes the European Trade Union Confederation a really independent trade union at the European level. Then, of course, there is a little portion of our budget that comes from European funding, but it's based on projects. So it's not, let's say, a direct transfer from the European Commission to the unions. That could be a bit challenging, I would say, but it's on the contrary, I mean, based on projects. So we submit, applications for funding linked to different topics that are linked to the general budget lines for social dialogue at the European level, and also the employers receive the same. So there is some kind of balance, but again, this represents 5 to 7% of our overall budget.
Okay. Yeah, the first thing we wanted to talk about is that we see a loss of democracy at the EU level, or the perception of a loss of democracy at EU level, and also the rise of Euroscepticism. And a little bit the question, how can we, as trade unions, raise awareness towards our workers, but also our representatives, about the importance of the EU level to provide solutions for various problems and challenges that we face nowadays?
Yeah. Well, we are, let's say, deeply discussing this problem at the moment within the European Trade Union Confederation with our members, also because our members are telling us that on average more or less 1/3 of their own members, so not all European workers, the members of the unions, 1/3 of the members in recent national elections, they have voted for far-right, populist, xenophobic, anti-migrants, anti-European parties. This happened in Belgium, in Sweden, in Italy, in Spain, in France, everywhere, including the eastern countries, of course. So we have a problem with our membership because we were not able, as the trade union movement, to explain to our members that behind these parties, the new parties, these far-right parties, there is really a big threat to democracy in the European Union. And so we are trying to understand why our workers, our members, have decided to vote for these parties. And I would say there are two main reasons behind. Of course, migrants is one element, security, all this. Okay, but this is only the surface of the problem. If you go behind all this and beyond all this, you understand that there are two major issues. The first issue is that, paradoxically, the major votes for these parties don't come from the regions in Europe where you have more migrants. But on the contrary, they come from the regions in Europe where you have higher unemployment, lower wages, where globalization, financialization, the crisis, the austerity measures have hit harder, and where people face incredible levels of social exclusion. So it is clear that there is the crisis of social Europe, the lack of protection for workers, for citizens, for families, against these incredible attacks and damage that came, from the crisis and from globalization, from unruled globalization, I would say, that destroyed rights, social protection, wages, collective bargaining, jobs, etc. This is the major root, I would say, of this general social discontent, unrest, and also fear about the future. The impression is that people don't think they could have a better future in front of them, that the future will be worse than the past, and particularly for their children. And there is no hope for the future to have a decent job, to have a decent salary, to have decent social protection, housing, a good environment to live in, to have a decent education and training for their children, etc., etc. And all this then leads these people to be afraid that others coming from abroad come to steal the little things that they could keep, after this incredible disruptive crisis that we have faced over the last few years. And so this is the major problem, the social crisis. But beside the social crisis, there is another major problem, that is the one you mentioned, and is the fact that the crisis and all the decisions that were taken, including the so-called structural reforms, the austerity measures, all these decisions were taken by excluding the citizens from a real democratic participation in these decisions. Look, for example, at what happened in Belgium when there was the discussion about the CETA, the agreement between the European Union and Canada. Local administrations were obliged to raise the problem, to mobilize people in the streets, I mean, to make sure that decisions that were already taken at the European level without consulting anybody, I mean, should be stopped. And the agreement must be reopened, I mean, to make sure that people can really participate in a more democratic process. Well, I think this is a very emblematic example on how people really feel to be completely disregarded when it comes to, to decision-making processes that are going on at the European as at the national level. So there is an economic crisis that led to a social crisis, but this crisis then led also to a democratic crisis. And the fact that most of the decisions that are taken at the European level have been moved from the only European institutions that is elected by citizens, that is the European Parliament, towards the Council, that is simply a sum of prime ministers and ministers that have not been elected, I mean, to rule Europe. They have been elected to rule their own country, but they are taking decisions for other countries without being liable and accountable towards the citizens of the countries they are ruling. Take Merkel or Schäuble, I mean, taking decisions for Greece without the Greek citizens having any possibility to have an influence on these decisions they don't agree with. So there is let's say, a break, I mean, a gap in the democratic process that has really upset and disappointed people regarding Europe and the European, let's say, institutional and democratic environment. So we as trade unions, we are really wondering and asking ourselves, what can we do, I mean? Not only to explain to our members that there is a crisis for democracy and voting for far-right movements is not the solution, but the reply is, okay, but what's the solution? And here comes our responsibility, to design a better future for people, to tell them there is an alternative to this kind of European Union. We can build up a better Europe for people, a Europe that at the same time provides with some hope for the future, a better future in social and economic terms, etc., but at the same time also provides with some concrete proposals on how to make the European decision-making process more democratic, transparent, and a process on which normal citizens, ordinary workers, can have an influence. This is the big challenge we have in front of us, especially when we approach the European elections. This will be the major element, because if we continue only discussing about migration, security and defense, and we don't address the real core of the problem, that is the social crisis and the democratic crisis, it will be very difficult for us to convince our members that another Europe is possible, I mean, and we can build it up.
To make it already a little bit more concrete, we hear a lot that, for example, workers are too expensive. We see a downward pressure on salaries. On the other hand, we also see increasing profits flowing back to shareholders. So there is some sort of redistribution of wealth from workers to shareholders. And there is a little bit the question, what are ETUC's priorities and strategies with regard to pay rise, collective bargaining to strengthen these wages and these salaries?
Yeah. We faced a double nasty rhetoric over the last few years. In the west of Europe, the rhetoric was, if you want to create jobs and not to have more unemployment, you have to reduce wages. And we were promised that if trade unions would have supported wage moderation, we would have unemployment defeated in the European Union, in the western part of Europe. And it didn't happen. And on the other side, in the eastern part of Europe, they were promised that if they would keep their wages so low, they would have gained an incredible competitive advantage and they would have a lot of jobs and also better life, etc., etc. And it didn't happen. So it's clear that, this rhetoric, this propaganda is absolutely fake. First of all in macroeconomic terms, because this neoliberal approach to the economy of the European Union showed that it's not working. And so now we have in the West the problem that we have based our economic growth that is back to some extent, although it's a very slightly economic growth, but okay, there is something happening in positive terms, in terms of economic growth, but an economic growth that was based simply and only on export, without considering the internal demand component in there, was not going to bring to more jobs. It was a totally jobless economic recovery, and it's still there. We have still 22 million unemployed people in the European Union, and even those jobs that have been created are mainly precarious with very low wages. And it's not true they are precarious and with very low wages because they are unskilled or low-skilled jobs. It's exactly the contrary. Very high-skilled people are working for incredibly low salaries and in a very precarious condition, particularly in the digital economy, platforms, etc., etc. So it's a total nonsense in terms of the economic theories that were at the basis of this. And on the other side, in the Eastern countries, even talking to ministers and prime ministers, they start being really fed up or being perceived as cheap labor countries. Because they thought for a while that being a cheap labor country, okay, is very good because you can export, you can have economic growth, etc. That's true. But they had incredibly high levels of economic growth in terms of GDP increases, etc., etc. But at what cost? Now those labor markets are completely impoverished. They had million young workers that left the countries, after the state had invested billion and billion of euros, for their education, and all this capital, this human capital, have been completely destroyed for these people leaving the country. That's why we launched a couple of years ago a great campaign at the European level for a pay rise for European workers, because we are convinced that having a pay rise in this moment that the economy is slightly going up and that there is an enormous amount of profits accumulated in the financial markets by the companies and the big multinational companies, particularly over the last few years, even during the crisis. It's really time for redistribution, because redistribution would at the same time help in addressing the lack of internal demand that we have in our single market, and so it will boost a job-rich economic growth. But second, it will also help in addressing the problem of the demographic decline of our society that makes our social protection systems substantially unsustainable in the long term. So the only way to make them more sustainable is to increase the number of jobs, but particularly to pay people more. Because if you pay people more and you pay more also the non-standard workers and the self-employed, and you make sure they contribute to the social protection and pension systems, then these systems can become back sustainable in the long run. So this was the macroeconomic and the social justice dimension why we decided to go for this campaign. The campaign was quite successful because we have achieved, on average, I would say 5% increase in wages in the Western countries of the European Union in the last couple of years, and 10 to 12% increase in the eastern part of Europe in terms of minimum wages. But then we have now a second problem to be addressed, that even if we make sure that wages go up by 5% in the West and by 10% in the East, it will take more than 100 years to fill the wage gap that still exists between the East and the West. There is a comparison that is not a unions, is the labor minister of Slovakia always brings to each and every meeting of the labor ministers of the European Union, to the EPSCO, and he says, okay, fine, we are okay with posting of workers, with equal treatment, etc., but we have another problem. And our problem is that we don't have equal treatment at home. And he says, let's take Volkswagen. And he always looks at the German minister when he says this. Let's take Volkswagen. The plants of Volkswagen in Germany and the plants of Volkswagen in Slovakia and in Poland. Well, in the plants of Volkswagen in Slovakia and in Poland, the workers, the native workers in there, they perform more or less 80 to 85% the level of productivity in comparison to German workers in Germany in Volkswagen plants. But the salaries are 25% in Slovakia and 40% in Poland. So it's really time to fill the wage gap. Because otherwise, if you simply go for a pay rise, you are going to keep the divergence forever, You need an extraordinary effort, to raise up the level of wages in the East. And the only way to do it is not minimum wages. Because even if you increase by 10% a year the minimum wages in the East, since the minimum wages are going to increase only the bottom level of the wage scale, they are not going to benefit the middle class. So there would be a real convergence process, but only a partial convergence process for the poverty threshold. That's why we are now launching a second step of our campaign that is about a partnership for wage convergence. And the purpose of this is to create proper collective bargaining institutions at sectoral level in the countries where either the collective bargaining at sectoral level is destroyed, like in the Southern Europe, or it never existed. Because we are talking about economies that had, let's say, a transition from the communist-based macroeconomic model to the capitalistic-based economic model without having a proper social dialogue and collective bargaining institution being established. And so that's now our priority, to make sure that through the semester, through negotiations, recommendations, social dialogue, we can really create proper collective bargaining in the countries where it doesn't exist, to make sure that all European workers can benefit from the same kind of industrial relations environment, I mean, for the future.
Yeah. How do you think that the social justice for working people can be restored or reinforced, and is the proclaimed European Pillar of Social Rights a step in the right direction?
Yeah, so the first thing to do for us is always reinforce the trade union power. And reinforcing the trade union power means establishing proper social dialogue and proper collective bargaining in each and every country. This is the first top priority in absolute terms, I mean. So having a demand-led economic model, so changing the economic paradigm to create quality jobs, etc., and increase wages and so on, and reinforce social dialogue. And in this respect, the European Pillar of Social Rights is a great opportunity, but to make it working properly, there are some conditions that should be met. The first condition is that, the European Pillar of Social Rights was proclaimed. It is, for the moment, an important political commitment, but is not yet binding, legally speaking. So there are, I would say, three things that should be done to make sure that the pillar can become really a legally binding piece of the European acquis, I would say. The first thing to do is that we need to implement it through European directives or legislative initiatives that can, let's say, implement some of the key principles that are enshrined in the European Pillar of Social Rights. And we have to recognize that the current European Commission has launched a series of initiatives. There are 13 now going on at the same time, but there are, let's say, I would say 5 that are the core ones. One was already achieved, that was the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive. So we have achieved equal treatment in terms of remuneration for people in the European Union. There is still the problem of the truck drivers that is not resolved, but anyway, in general, for the other workers is there. There is still to this specific problem to be fixed, but we are doing our best, I mean, to have it fixed. But then there are at least 5 crucial elements, I mean, that are under discussion at the moment in Parliament, in Council, and so on. One is the Work-Life Balance Directive that should introduce more equality at work, I mean, between women and men, and for families, etc. The second one is probably the most important element in legal terms, that is this Transparent and Predictable Working Conditions Directive, that is going to introduce really a level playing field in terms of basic rights, I would say, for each and every worker, regardless of the employment status. So this piece of legislation, if it is achieved properly, will really extend a minimum floor of rights to non-standard workers, platform workers, gig economy, self-employed, freelancers, etc., etc. So it's something very important. The discussion is still going on. We are lobbying very hard, I mean, to make sure that the right content are in there when the directive will be finally adopted, but it's a promising discussion, so it's something positive in terms of principle. Then we have all the so-called social fairness package, that is the one encompassing all the social elements, I mean, the social protection systems and so on. And here we have the revision of the regulation at the European level that rules, I mean, the coordination of social security for mobile workers, the so-called regulation 883. That is very crucial. It's a bit technical if you want, but it's very important, I mean, to make sure that social dumping and wage dumping can be properly addressed, I mean, in the cross-border dimension. Then we have this recommendation on social security systems that is going to extend the coverage of social protection systems to non-standard workers and self-employed workers. It's not the case in several countries, I mean. And last but not least, and this is at the moment the most controversial political fight, I would say, is this the establishment of this European Labour Authority. So a body that at the European level should address all the abuses and frauds that still exist, particularly in the cross-border dimension within the European single market when it comes to free movement of workers. So if we can achieve these 5 tools, we have a big job done. I mean, there is already, I mean, some concrete and strong implementation of the European level. But as I say, this is not enough. We have other 2 elements that should be achieved. One element is that we need to make sure that then also member states will implement national legislation to make sure that the major principles out of the 20 in the social pillar are then implemented in practice at the national level. This is more difficult, of course, and again, we need for that proper social dialogue to be working at the national level to push the governments, I mean, to implement all this. I have to say that in comparison to the past, the ETUC is taking a more active role at the national level, together with our members, being directly in touch with prime ministers, labor ministers, to make sure that some of these pieces of legislation are actually properly achieved. It's not an easy job, but we are trying really to improve in this respect, and some results are already coming. And then there is a third element that is purely legal, you know. So how to make sure that the pillar can become a legal reference for courts when they rule cases in the labor market regarding labor law, social protection law, etc. And there is a way to make sure that this happens. It is the way that was followed when the European Charter of Social Rights was proclaimed some decades ago. The Charter was proclaimed exactly in the same process as for the pillar, so it's a political commitment, but then in each and every European piece of legislation, in each and every national piece of legislation, in the recitals, in the premises of the laws, the European Charter of Social Rights was mentioned as a legal reference. And this made the Charter becoming a piece of legislation, although it was only proclaimed and not approved, no, through the normal legislative process. So despite the Charter is not a piece of the treaties, it became a reference for courts, including the European Court of Justice, to rule labor cases. The same we should do with the European Pillar of Social Rights. So we should make sure that the pillar is mentioned in each and every recitals of the European directives, in each and every recitals of the national directives, in a way that the courts, including the ECJ, start using it as a reference to rule disputes and cases. And this is not only a plan of the trade unions, this is at the moment a plan of the European Commission. So the legal services of the European Commission are doing their best to make sure that in each directive that is going to be implemented at the European level, that touches upon a little bit with the social field, I mean, a reference to the pillar is included, even by mentioning individual principles out of the 20, in a way that is very concrete, I mean, that the law interprets and implements at the same time the pillar, and then it's for the courts, I mean, to use the pillar as a reference to rule the cases. Yeah. So putting together these 3 elements, national legislation, European legislation, and court cases based on the references to the pillar, we think that, of course, not immediately, no, not overnight, but I mean, in few years probably, we can really create a strong, no, European corp of legislation that can really make sure that the pillar will be a sort of treaty for workers, let's say.
Ja. what exactly is ETUC's position with regard to climate change transition? Can you maybe briefly explain?
Of course. Regarding the topics you mentioned, there are, I would say, two dimensions. One dimension is global, but it has very local consequences, and it is climate change, but also energy change, and also digitalization and automation. These elements have an incredible impact on number of jobs that can be destroyed, created, and what kind of transition we want to put in place for workers to be protected in these transformations. It's clear that it's not our job, to oppose changes that must happen, particularly on climate change. It's fundamental, to green the economy and to make sure that we can have a sustainable growth model in place that can really protect the environment at the same time as jobs and economic prosperity. But it's our job to make sure, that nobody's left behind. And the same happens when it comes to digitalization, automation. Technology is not bad or good. No, in principle. It depends how you use it, to improve people's life and to make sure that there's well-being for everybody. But in any case, even if you go towards the better, in terms of a greener environment or in terms of more digital help for people in their life, in their work, etc., there is a transition phase that could really create troubles for people. For miners that see a mine close down, or for steel workers that see a plant close down, or for, let's say, producers, workers in a production plant, that see robots coming, and taking over their jobs. So there is an issue on how we can make sure, first, that through public and private investment and through improvement of skills, we can, first of all, create new jobs. Because it's unavoidable that some jobs will be destroyed, but we have to create an exact number of jobs that is able to replace the jobs that are destroyed. And then there is a second step to be considered, that is the fact that we have to manage the transition in a way that the workers are able to move from a job to another, being reskilled properly, and be able to cope with a new type of job that is not exactly the same as the one they were used to perform before this transition took place. And to do that, there is a need of money, so significant resources, particularly public resources, to be put at disposal of the local communities, the local administrations, but also trade unions and employers, to make sure that they can manage the transition, they can create jobs and then move people without traumas, to the new job. But this needs also policy, this needs governance, this needs dialogue, social dialogue, to make sure that everybody is on board.
We see a lot of tax avoidance schemes of multinational companies which undermine also resources and capabilities of governments to create fair and just societies, but also to adapt to changes. What exactly are the Confederation's demands with regard to fair taxation?
Well, there are two elements in there. The first element is to make sure that the corporate taxation is fair at the European level. This means that we need really to have a minimum level of taxation for corporates in each and every European country. The European Commission, we have to be honest, has launched some initiatives, particularly Commissioner Moscovici launched a package, on tax justice, let's say, for corporates, with the introduction of a minimum level of taxation and also some measures against tax avoidances, tax evasion, particularly for big multinational companies, in the digital sector. This was the major problem. It was the original problem, but then, of course, it's not only the digital multinationals. There is also tax evasion in other sectors. We hope that the Council in the end will adopt these measures, because this will be a fundamental contribution, to have more social justice for corporates and to make sure that also national budgets and social protection systems can be funded properly. But this is not the only point. There is also another point, that is social justice in general, also for citizens, because some initiatives that have been taken by some governments introducing these so-called flat taxes. Flat taxes eliminate any progressive justice in terms of taxation systems. And this is really a strong attack to tax democracy. It's not only about corporates, you know, it's also about tax justice for citizens, for workers, for everybody. We cannot accept that the rich pays less than the poor in proportional level, in terms, I mean. This is absolutely out of the basic rules of any democracy. So there is an issue for minimum taxation for corporates, but at the same time there is also an issue for tax social justice and democratic justice, I mean. And on this, I have to say, also because of the limitations in the treaty, the European Union is a bit more shy. And it's very difficult for them to stop this kind of flat taxes that have been introduced by several countries, not only in the East, not only Orban and others, but now, you know, it's also a discussion going on in Italy and in other countries. It's very dangerous.
Okay. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I think in 2019 there will be European elections. There will be important elections. What are the main demands of the European Confederation towards members of parliament or candidates to the 2019 European elections?
We are developing our own manifesto for the elections, and we are already meeting with all the major parties, I mean, to make sure that our demands are taken over in their programs. By the way, the parties will convene in their congresses at the end of this year also to choose the so-called Spitzenkandidaten, I mean, those should run for president of the Commission. So there is a very good momentum for us, I mean, to push for our demands and make sure that they are considered by the parties. We have decided to limit the number of demands, so we have 5 top priorities that, by the way, will be also the priorities that will be bring to our Congress, the ETUC Congress, that takes place exactly on the same week of the elections. So there is an incredible coincidence in this respect. And the demands are, again, a different macroeconomic model based on investment and demand to create quality jobs, higher wages and wage convergence through collective bargaining, reinforced collective bargaining everywhere, managing just transition in the climate change environment, but also for digitalization, automation, globalization, and so on and so forth. Then reinforcing the European social model, particularly by making the European Pillar of Social Rights binding through legislation for social protection systems, etc., etc. And last but not least, I mean, equal treatment and integration for migrants in the European labor market, making sure that each and every worker is treated in the same way, I mean, and in a decent way. And then there is a very final and transversal priority that is that we need to fight for democracy, making sure that on the one side democracy is protected from far-right and anti-democratic parties and movements, but also democracy is reformed in a way that the lack of democracy we have faced so far in the European decision-making process can be really addressed properly, making sure that people can really feel that their voices are heard, I mean, by the European politicians, but also by the national politicians, and that common people and workers can really have an influence on the decisions to be taken after the European elections, I mean, to set the Commission and then to implement, I mean, the priorities.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for
this
very
interesting
interview and conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.